Hi, and welcome to the Conscious Divorce Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Milrad, and today we're exploring something that could fundamentally transform how you think about raising children after divorce. Here's the truth. It took me some time to understand. When your marriage ends, one partnership dissolves, but another one must begin. You are no longer partners in marriage, but you will always be partners in raising your children. The question isn't whether this partnership exists, it's whether it will be functional or dysfunctional, healing or harming. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Lisa Lisser, founder of LZL Coaching, a boutique coaching firm focused on divorce, relationships, and co-parenting. Lisa is a certified divorce coach and also holds a certification in BEH2O, a child-centered co-parenting process. Lisa brings a unique perspective. She's a former litigation attorney who practiced in New York City, holds a master's degree in Jewish education, and is a certified spiritual counselor. She has over 20 years of nonprofit leadership experience and is a mother of three grown children who navigated her own divorce after 21 years of marriage. Lisa, it's so great to have you here.
Oh, thanks for inviting me, Justin. I'm glad to be here.
So let me ask you a question. Can you talk about a good co-parenting relationship, an example perhaps, and what a bad co-parenting relationship is, and why we need to kind of go down this path to make sure that we have, a consciously crafted co-parenting relationship?
Okay. So I'm going to start by um, fighting the hypothetical, okay? Because I think that there is really no good or bad. I think that all parents are trying to do the best they can with the information they have. And most people, when they are approaching co-parenting after divorce, the only uh, touch point they have is the experience they had before. And the fears and the distrust and the anger they have related to their um, marriage relationship that failed or that was no longer successful. I'll put it that way. And so it takes a while for co-parents to recognize that that doesn't have to define them for the rest of their lives, the old relationship. And it took me a while. I was in a mindset like I was worried about my spouse. I didn't see eye to eye to him on parenting, which was part of our dilemma in the first place. And I didn't know how it would be different. And so we sort of took sides. We were more parallel parents than cooperative parents. And, to a certain extent, that works. That's a style of co-parenting. Um, our kids knew that we didn't get along. Our kids, worried about saying something to mom that would upset mom or something to dad that would upset dad. And so they developed their own mechanisms for how to deal with that. But ultimately, what we learned over time was that we both were raising these kids and we needed to find a way to be on the same page on at least some issues. And we had to also let go of the keys of trying to control each other. So when my children were at their dad's, um, which is really their home where dad was the CEO, they had one way of operating. And when they were at my house, they had another way. And they worked it out. I don't know if it was the best co-parenting relationship at that time, but kids learn how to deal with what they have. My goal as a co-parenting coach is to give parents better tools so that they can navigate the relationship with less conflict because the single marker for children's security and safety is their exposure to the conflict. So if we can reduce the conflict the parents are experiencing, we can make safer, more secure environments for children to thrive. So that's what I talk about. And it's not like you have a good relationship or a bad relationship, or you're a good co-parent or a bad co-parent. It's let's learn some new skills so that we can co-parent differently. Because the way we did it before is not going to succeed in our new iteration of the family we now have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so and very helpful. So there's definitely a mindset there that has to take place. You know, you are partners in marriage and love at one point, and then you're no longer partners in marriage and love. But the one partnership that will never end, and really a new partnership that has to be established, is being, partners in your kids' lives to make sure that you co-parent as best as possible. So can you kind of talk about what the conscious transition is to get to that point?
So the work I do through BEH2O is it functions by transforming the mindset from looking at their parenting relationship as part of the marriage. And now it's a parenting relationship that's a business partnership. So whenever we have a business, we need to know why we're doing it in the first place. Simon Sinek talks about start with why, the purpose, the goals. And I invite the parents to consider what is their why in this co-parenting journey? What is the goal that they have? Long term, immediate term, midterm. And what we come up with is we want to safeguard our children's childhood so they can feel like kids and we don't parentify them. So if we want to keep the kids safe, then that is our touchstone for all of our interactions with our co-parent. Now, it's not easy and it takes time to get to that. But just thinking differently completely shifts the way people walk into this co-parenting space. They still may want to get their co-parent to do something a certain way, but what we start to recognize is that this is not about getting our co-parent to do something. It's about getting ourselves um, in alignment with what are our values and what are the actions we can take to enforce those values or reinforce those values, not only for ourselves, but to instill them in our kids.
That's really interesting and something that I see with my clients and something I experience myself is, if you go down the traditional route where you just call a lawyer instead of a divorce coach, one of the last things they tell you to do, which should probably be one of the first things, is to take the mandatory co-parenting course. Because during the time of separation and while you're going through the divorce, you don't necessarily have the skills and best practices to be an effective co-parent, and you start making some mistakes. So number one, to anyone listening to the podcast, make sure you take those classes early in the process, but also realize that the process of divorce with an attorney is just a point of time. If you really want to set yourself up for success, you want to make sure that you engage, with a divorce coach or a co-parenting expert so that you can kind of design and architect, the best possible outcomes for your kids. Because what we know is divorce doesn't destroy kids, but how the parents handle divorce and really damage the kids over the long term. So, Lisa, this is kind of like a two-part question. But the first part is, can you talk about some of the things that parents do, today that are not helpful for co-parenting relationships? And then can you kind of define for everyone what BEH2O is and maybe some of the thought process between, correcting some of these actions and doing things right the first way?
So I think one of the things that parents do that is not effective is they think in terms of I've got to get my co-parent to do it my way. I've got to get them to behave differently. And if they don't, then it's on them. It's not on me. And what we do with BEH2O is we create a real mindset shift because your co-parent is not an object that you can move. Your co-parent is a person. And so once we start to think about our co-parent as a person, it does soften things. We might not always like that person, but they're human and they have their own underlying issues. They have their own concerns. They actually have their own worries about the child that you may not think about because there's something that's behind their behavior. So, what we do in BEH2O is we invite the clients to step into their co parents' shoes And that's not easy. But if we can step into their shoes, then we can model different behavior. And, I talk a lot about the science of it, the neuroplasticity. We have mirror neurons. When we behave differently, the people around us are going to behave differently. So that can work in both ways. So if there's a person, you may be calm and cool and collected around 95% of the people in your life. But there are 5% of the people who really hit your nerve. And those are the people who can get you to raise your voice, and you raise their voice, and then they raise their voice, and then it gets louder and louder, and no one's making a point. They're just yelling at each other. And that may be how it's been with your co-parent. Or you might just give each other the silent treatment. And again, you're not communicating in a productive way, but you're modeling it for each other. So, what we do in BEH2O is we first invite the co parent to identify, why does this thing matter so much to me? Why is it so important? And we actually help them craft something we call I feel statements. So I feel X, an emotion, when a situation happens. And we don't say, when you always do this. We craft it so it's the facts of what happened because I value X or because I believe in Y. But you're giving a real structure so people can start to understand their own emotional background. And then we invite them to say, so what do you think is going on for your co-parent? And we say, look, you don't have to have empathy for them, but think of this as strategic empathy. And it's not because they deserve it, but it's because your children deserve it. So, how is what you're doing working for you? And if you're never getting the result you want and your co parent never does things the way you want them to, let's reframe that so that you can start to create your own boundaries, to create your own vocabulary, to create your own language that lifts you and the why you have for your children. Why do you care so much about after school activities? What's really underlying that? Like, we go into the nitty gritty. And that's what I find so powerful about BEH2O because it really helps you think about things differently. And it also gives you grace because a lot of our behaviors are part of our amygdala, our sympathetic nervous system, that we cannot stop certain behaviors unless we intentionally pause so that we can respond rather than react. And that's also a learned response. So that's part of another tool we work with people. Well, so they recognize when are they being triggered and then they think about it. Even just 1 second of recognizing they're feeling triggered helps them change how they take the next step.
No, you did mention a little early about, kids parenting their parents. And this is something that, we hear when a divorce goes bad, that becomes a problem. The kids are in the middle. They're, relaying messages from one parent to another. And, often this happens when the parents don't do the work or they don't really consider the long-term impact. At what point during the divorce process, because, they're not all amicable. Many times they're not. And then even when the divorce is settled and you get your decree and you get your stamp, one spouse is typically angry at the other spouse, or maybe they're angry at each other. And they're still trying to get their revenge or get the final word in and to get some frustration out. So, at what point in the divorce process would you advise someone who really wants to make sure they have an amicable and strong co-parenting relationship to get, working, in the BEH2O or some other model?
Right. So I think as soon as you can. Look, um, for many people, it's really hard to do this constructive, collaborative co-parenting thought process while they're in the height of the conflict of their divorce. Like it's not an easy thing. I have worked with clients in this scenario, and I walk them through how to respond to difficult emails and what is really at stake, and how do we communicate in a way that is not pushing your co-parents buttons. So the sooner you could start thinking differently, the better. But whether it's feasible or practical is a whole other question, because at the beginning of divorce, there's pain, there's hurt, there's shame, and you're trying to process your own emotions and your grief. And you have to make all these big decisions. And so it's really hard for the kids, but also how you sometimes put the kids in the middle. You may not think that's what you're doing, but if you say, look at how bad daddy's treating me, look at how bad daddy's treating us, then you're putting the kids in the middle. If you're saying, she's lazy, she won't go back to work, you're putting the kids in the middle. And you're also having the potential to alienate them from your co-parent. And that's not beneficial to your kids. You might think it's beneficial to you, but it's not, because your kids are going to be really hurting.
So we know what happens when things go off the rails and, off track. Can you kind of talk about what a strong, effective co-parenting relationship looks like and what some of the benefits are?
Wow. Well, so the benefits are everything, right? The benefits are you can either show up together at an event or you could take turns. If your kids feel stressed that when you're together that you might be fighting or that there's too much heavy energy, you can say, okay, this concert mom will go to, that concert I'll go to, this karate lesson I'll go to, you can, and that could be the best form of co-parenting, right? Because you're actually thinking, all right, how do my kids really feel? We might have an image like we have to always do everything together, but that might not be the best thing for your children, right? Because your children feel all of these stresses. Um, people said to me during my divorce, oh, kids are resilient. Don't worry about the kids. And that's hard because kids may be resilient, but they experience life. They experience all the hardship. They know that something is going on that's impacting them that they have no control over, and they didn't ask for this. So that's where you need to have a little, compassion or rachmanis, to use a Yiddish word, for your kids. And even when they're acting out. So, you can't. Many of us do try to get our kids on our side, but that's not really the healthiest thing for our kids. We just don't know it when it's happening. And so that's why sort of learning tools like BEH2O methodology is helpful for you in all aspects of your life, like not just with your kids, but with your co-parents, but also with your lawyers, and also with your parents and your siblings and your social network. Like learning how to communicate from your why, grounding in your values and what's most important to you. That's probably the single most important thing you can do starting from the beginning of your divorce. Because, yeah, you don't know what this divorce is going to do to you, for you, what opportunities are ahead, and you're scared. So let's ground yourself in what you know, what your values are. And that's what I say to all my clients.
I think what's really interesting, depending on the ages of your kids, you have to plan for different stages of their life, right? Like, we're Jewish and, we have to plan for bar and bat mitzvahs. And then, some kids want a sweet 16 and then they need a car and then, perhaps they want to go to college. So it's important that it's not a one-time, let's agree to X, Y, and Z, and those are the rules. So like in business, we equate this to a partnership. It's no longer a partnership in love. it's a partnership in the children. But in business, typically there's an annual review. There's a meeting to talk about how the year went, and then some planning for the current year and future years. So, based on your experience, is this a one and done, or is this something that, we have an annual meeting, we talk about how things are going, and we keep strengthening the relationship so that at some point we can easily pick up the phone when something's going on, or you want to think about something about the future and have that conversation. What's kind of like your opinion there?
So my opinion there is um, we're going to have regular communication. Um, the time frame and the regularity is your operating system. So one thing that we do with BEH2O is we invite the parents to create weekly kids news emails that give the other parent all the information that we have about what's going on that week, who has to be where, what are each of our obligations, but each of us share this kids news with each other based on what we know. And you don't you're not required by law to tell your co-parent what the kids are doing when they're on your time, as it were. But that doesn't mean that you don't tell them because it's good for your kids when your co-parent knows what they're doing. Like when you find out that your kids are going on a vacation to Mexico and you didn't even know that was happening, that creates conflict. So if you can share with your co-parent those kinds of things, not because they asked for it, not because they're entitled to it, because your kids are entitled to have parents who don't feel blindsided. So when you talk about like revisiting, it's about developing a system of communication that allows you to revisit. Like if you say something like every year on this date, we have to have a meeting, that could feel pedantic. Yet, you mentioned we're both Jewish. We are at that time of year that we come to every year where we have the opportunity to do a self-accounting and a looking back of what the year that passed and what we hope for the year to come. And that could be a great rhythm to incorporate into your co-parenting. That like every year, like maybe when June comes around and they finished a year of school, maybe now is the time to sit down and realize, okay, so what's on the agenda going forward? That so summer is a different time, but what are we planning for the next year? And it may feel artificial, but once it becomes a habit and a ritual, then it starts to feel natural. And actually learning how to speak to your co-parent in a way that feels natural is such a gift. And, it might have been that during the marriage, like nothing felt natural anymore. You didn't communicate well. So, what would it feel like to actually incorporate a presence and a system and a practice? That's what we share with the co-parents. That is sort of the blessing in disguise of now just focusing on the kids. Don't focus on whatever hurts you had. They happened. I'm not saying forget them, but release the anger, which is another word for forgiving. But like release the anger because it doesn't serve you to have them taking up space in your brain.
I think something that's, the community. Sometimes clients want to withhold information from the other parent because they have no right to know. It's none of their business. I get that a lot. But sometimes when you communicate in advance, like for example, planning on taking the kids to Disney, and then the other parent may say, well, I was planning on taking the kids to Disney. Well, maybe you can come up with a solution. Maybe, the kids, one parent takes the beginning of the trip and the other parent takes the end of the trip. You just don't want to create contentious situations. So open communication and resolution is very effective, for the kids. And frankly, you want to know what's going on in your kids' lives. So Unless there's a really good reason not to share that information, I'm always a proponent of what's the worst thing that can happen? Like, is this really a big deal? Yes, maybe you have no obligation legally to tell them you're taking them to Disney, but you know what? For the sake of your kids, it's probably something worth sharing because guess what? The other parent may have some really good ideas to make the trip more wonderful. Or they may, say, oh, when were you planning on taking them? Oh, by the way, th this is going on during that time period. You may want to rethink about the date or make a decision on which of the two things. So, you know, I, I'm a big believer that communication is really important. And unless there's a good reason, communicate, communicate, communicate.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think that it's important to communicate. I think more communication doesn't mean it's better, but I think structured communication helps.
For
So,
sure.
like you don't want to be in a situation where communicate, 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 and you are getting texts out the wazoo and they're not necessarily collaborative, but they're starting to feel coercive. So you need to recognize that how you communicate and the boundaries you set up around the communication is actually what creates healthier communication.
Yep. And that's really important. Some people have to communicate through an app. Other people, provide and offer up a little more flexibility. One of the things I do with my ex is we share photos. So if one of us, is with the kids and something, cute happens, or we're on a vacation and we want to share it, with the other one, we don't have to say anything. We'll just send a picture and, heart it or something. But it's really powerful and it makes you feel like you're part of the event yourself. And you get
Yeah.
to share with your kids and talk about it. So I think that's really a
Right.
beautiful thing.
One of the things that can be upsetting or hurtful is when your kids decide that they're not going to tell you the stuff they did at dad's house or at mom's house because they don't want to hurt your feelings. They don't want you to feel bad that you weren't part of it. But it can come across as feeling like it's a secret, and that also is hurtful. So, teaching your children that open communication, that structured communication is a plus, is a way to sort of nip that in the bud. So, like, I can say, it's okay to let dad know. I already told him, right? He already knows that we're doing X. So let's work together on that. It totally can shift the dynamic.
Up soon. So I have one more question. Assuming that one, develops a strong co-parenting relationship with the other, there will be certain times where the co-parents face an impasse. What are some things for the listeners to think about of how do you address that?
How do you address the impasse? Um, this is where I work with my co-parents to help them see you may be in an impasse and you each have perspectives. So trying to step into the other's shoes. What is their perspective? What do you think is motivating this impasse? And where do you have shared values? Because even when you're at an impasse, you both likely have a shared value of doing the best thing for your child. So this is where you could identify for yourself which of your values does your interest serve? Like I wouldn't even use the word position. And then think about the co-parent, which of their values does their interest serve? And how do you find shared language around that? It's hard. This is not something that is easy to resolve. And sometimes you will be at an impasse and you may have to say, so this is what I've decided. And, you know, if you can share um, alternate, um, let me understand the reasoning behind it. And shift the way the conversation goes. So you are inviting dialogue as opposed to position taking.
You have to agree to disagree. And so I guess it's time we have to wrap up. Lisa, how do people get in touch with you?
Oh, thank you for asking. You can find me online at lzlcoaching.com. Z is my maiden name, Zimmer. So Lisa Zimmer Lisser, and I changed that to LZL Coaching. Um, you can find me on my podcast, Dishing on Divorce, wherever you stream your podcasts. And you also can set up a free consult for 30 minutes right through my website. So I look forward to reaching out to many of your audience and, working together to build new communication patterns that will reduce conflict. It won't solve all the conflicts, but it's about managing conflict. And that's the biggest thing you can do for your kids.
You're terrific, and this is such an important topic, often glossed over in the traditional process. So I hope that many people reach out to you, and you know, we got to be the best examples we can be to our kids, and we have to make sure that it's as positive an experience, and we continue to invest in them and
Yeah.
into ourselves. So thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Okay.